Provincial Police. Where's your emergency?
He came in the house with a gun. My sister's screaming and she's lying on the ground.
Everything was as if it was a play. Carl opened the door. Anastasia walked right out the door. I walked in the house, I opened the door, and Natalie's right there. It was like as if it was supposed to be. I am innocent. I've done nothing wrong.
A deadly rampage that crisscrossed the picturesque Madawaska Valley in eastern Ontario. Early in the morning, a gunman drove to 3 different communities, killing 3 women.
A little closer, making the arrest. Cut you. We're on, we're just cuffing him now.
Can you please confirm this is Basil?
Basil Palutsky.
10-4.
Really, all I want to know is, well, what's your understanding of why we're here right now, Basil?
You're here trying to get me to say something to incriminate me in any way you possibly can.
The 3 individuals that were murdered are Carol Culleton, Anastasia Kuziak, and Natalie Warmerton. Now, obviously, as of right now, you have been arrested for murder, okay? So, if you'd like to phone a lawyer.
For killing, not murder. I didn't murder anybody.
What's the difference between killing and murder?
Thou shalt not murder. Commandments.
And I believe it's actually thou shalt not kill.
If you're wrong, you better start reading the Bible.
Yeah?
Yeah. Find an old version before they changed it. Mine only was also murder, that's all I do. It's murder, kill somebody that's innocent.
So, in terms of Carol and Anastasia and Natalie, would you say you killed them or murdered them?
I killed them because they were not innocent. They were guilty. I was innocent. I done nothing wrong in God's eyes.
This is a guy who likes to think that he is a good Christian and that he is a good person and these people who wrong him are bad people. It's a very, I think, unconvincing, I'm a good guy, I'm the victim presentation. One thing that approaches psychopathy with it is it's really lacking an awareness that no one's really gonna buy his sob story.
He's just trying to rationalize and justify his actions in a way that make moral sense, but it's not at all believable.
So he's also showing this kind of very, I think, superficial anguish, this emotion. He reminds me of any number of men who've been kicked out of their girlfriend or wife's houses, usually girlfriends, where they have a little parasitic relationship with a girlfriend. The girlfriend finally kicks him out and they show up in a psychiatric emergency room saying they're suicidal, trying to basically get out of trouble. And they present in this real, like, I'm such a victim, things are so hard for me. And it's usually pretty transparent. And I think that's one of the interesting things for him is he's kind of out of touch with his audience. He's not a very good psychopath, and that he's not able to manipulate people well. It's hard to watch him and not feel anger towards him, or if you've been doing this for a while, almost like amusement at how poorly he's executing it.
When you woke up, what can you remember about that?
I left around 8 o'clock. I was beside myself, like I was looking at this from over there. I could see myself
But what did you see yourself doing?
Walking from the house to the car. I believe that God was telling me where to turn, because I was driving on roads that I didn't even know where they were going. And I was wondering, what the hell am I doing here? And then in a bunch of little towns.
It felt as if God was telling me. So it's kind of distancing language. He's not really coming close to taking responsibility and certainly not feeling remorse.
He believes he has a special relationship with God. It's his ego talking, that he is special, he's a chosen one, that he is above the rest of us in his ability to decide who dies and who lives.
And I just drove in, and I remember thinking that God is really helping me, because when I went to Carl walked right outside. I said, "Why do you hate me?" And then she closed the door. I was right there. And then I broke the window with my elbow. I reached in and I unlocked the door. And she said, "This is not you, babe. This is not you." You know, then she told me that your new boyfriend, Dave, was coming over because the hydro was out. And I said, "You're lying to me again." And there was a cable TV coil. I picked it up and I hit her with it and I wrapped it around her head. And she just kept saying, "This is not you, Basil, this is not you." But this doesn't mean I wasn't doing that. I see myself doing that. Doesn't make sense. I was over there. I'm here. I'm like a camera, and I'm as if I was watching with a camera myself.
He talks about watching himself on camera. I think that's also part of his own narcissism. You know, look at what I did. Particularly the more psychopathic somebody is and the more narcissistic somebody is, watching themselves is really an ultimate honor.
I finally went crazy, didn't I? And I wasn't putting up with no more. I thought, I'm going to shoot the leave me alone.
So how long have you known Carol for?
Approximately 3 years. Before.
And are you in a relationship with her?
Yes. I told her, "You asked me to do stuff for you, and then when I do it, you tell me that I wasn't supposed to do it." She was, I don't think bipolar, really. Terry just doesn't make the mind, you keep changing your mind.
Basil Barutsky, when you pay attention to his crimes and what he's done, is very classically a chronic domestic violence perpetrator. He's a misogynist, and he's a psychopath. He has a difficult time not getting his way. He has a complete lack of respect for women and sees them as objects. He is devoid of typical emotion and attachment to people. He has a history of stalking Carol, of showing up at her home unannounced, showing up to do work on her property that she didn't ask for, and while she's not there. Here's an excerpt from a letter that Barutsky wrote Carol. "I'm a deep thinker. I worry about the world, the planet, the people, the pollution. That's me. I can't change me. I am a loving, caring human being. I am a good person." He's trying to convince her that he's this horribly misunderstood person. And you see that time and time again with domestic violence. Perpetrators justify their own rage. If you would just behave, I wouldn't need to do this to you.
Monday, I was at the cottage. And that's when that's when she said that her and her man called me BF. She told me that they had this joke with me being BF, best friend, the guy that would do anything. She said that they thought it was funny, and she was laughing in the house.
Certainly, knowing that people are joking about him, it's very challenging to his ego. It's a challenge to his masculinity, his role as a provider, his sexual potency. He's not a competitor anymore. He's not a romantic competitor. He's your old BF. He's your friend. He is not somebody to be threatened by. I can imagine that being intensely threatening to him. And so that's that kind of egotistical, self-centered component that you might see in psychopathy.
My guess would be when he killed Carol, he actually felt good. He felt a release of the rage, humiliation, shame.
I remember driving the car. I'm outside the door. And I remember God's helping me do what's right. God's making this easy. Because when I got to Anastasia's, she walked out the door. Wasn't even at the door, she just walked out. I asked Anastasia, I just said, why did you lie in court? And she said, I didn't. It was as if it was supposed to be. She turned around, walked in, I walked right in behind her, and the gun went off. There was a little island, and she was standing, and she just went down, and the gun went off after she went down.
Borutsky was convicted back in 2014 of assault and for attempting to choke, suffocate, or strangle Anastasia Cusick, along with a charge of mischief for burning her property. He spent nearly 2 years in prison.
I wasn't guilty. Because it just lies. I sat in jail for a whole year, rotted like a dog, knowing that all I did was read the Bible. It's red, 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 red. Gotta be trapped, punched out. Because old guys like me that are crippled, you're American, you're fun for all. That's a cruel place there. I never hit that woman. Anastasia beat the She burned all my clothes. She burned my boots. She burned everything. Oh, I kept that house from burning down so she was going to throw a can of acid. She was crazy. She's bipolar.
He believes every woman in his life is bipolar. That's what he's talking about with the 3 victims. And ultimately, what he's really doing is trying to discredit them. He's trying to say, don't believe them, they're irrational. Borutsky's blaming the victim, things that he's responsible for, actions that he ultimately was proven in a court of law to have done. He now assigns to her. His narrative of his history is that he was wrongfully convicted, he was wrongfully sent to jail. What we know in public record is that Borutsky served 2 years in prison for seriously assaulting Anastasia.
There was another girl there. She had toothbrush in her mouth. She said, who are you? I said, I'll kill you. And that's all. And the gun went off. I said, God, what do I do now? told me to get in the car and drive down the highway. And then to the farm.
Whose farm is this?
It wasn't really Natalie's. It's not because she lied.
What happened when you went to Natalie's farm on Tuesday?
What happened? I just drove in, walked in the door. She was sitting there. She went around the corner, I followed her. Boom, walked out. That's it.
What happened at Natalie's?
I asked a question. And as soon as I asked the question, she lied. And that's what, it's just like lie bang. Next thing you know, the police are there and I'm charged with threatening to hang him when all I said is, if you don't smarten up, I'll string you up. Meaning, listen, kid, do I deserve to go to jail for that? No. So she used the system. The whole thing is so stupid.
One thing that abusers often do that terrifies women is they threaten their children. They try to figure out the best way to manipulate, control, and get obedience and submission from the woman. So it's about control. And if he's not getting enough control, then you hit where it hurts the most. And for mothers, it's the child, so he threatens the safety of her son.
Ultimately, his narrative of this, once again, is that he's misunderstood. And that Natalie is actually to blame. She's the manipulative person. Natalie made the decision that any protective parent would, which was to pursue charges, to use the legal system to help protect her.
So what did these women do to you that made you have to kill them? That's the burning question of the day.
I was put in jail twice, wrongfully. All because you believe the lies. Use police, and then take the lies and you project them to the courts. Use the police. Because yous have attacked me. Yous are the enemy. Over and over and over.
He's full of self-pity and consistent deflection of responsibility and blaming everyone else for his actions. He's always the victim. This kind of manipulation and minimization and denial and twisting of reality is very, very common in domestic abusers, but it is also a psychopathic trait.
How do you feel about what's happened to these women, Basil? How do you feel right now? Not at the time is what I'm getting at. Right now, me and you in this room.
Empty.
Barutsky is a psychopath, and that's what you expect to see in somebody who's a psychopath. He doesn't spend a lot of time taking responsibility for his own behavior. Affect and emotions are shallow, he's impulsive, and he doesn't lose a whole lot of sleep over that.
Do you understand how what's happened to these three women is wrong?
Yeah. Yet when I asked Anastasia, why did you lie? Why couldn't she just have said, I'm sorry? I'm sure now I would have stopped. That would have been enough. I'll have bad bone in my body.
He likes to view himself, I think, as being a good person, even though all the evidence is to the contrary. And when that's questioned, he responds really angrily. He likes to kind of drink his own Kool-Aid. His Kool-Aid is, I'm a good person, and I am the victim here.
A guilty verdict was handed down in the brutal murders of Carol Culleton, Anastasia Kuzyk, and Natalie Warmerdam that had so many warning signs. Brudski represented himself during the trial, refusing to utter a single word or ask a single question, despite being given multiple opportunities. Then, on the final day, with the jury absent, Brudski called the judge a liar.
Right here for me, sir.
You understand this is big tape right now, right? Oh, so that's what that big square of light is. This is where my friend Sean and I put Edward's body to dispose of it. We drag the body up along there, just right on top of the ridge there. I wind up having to get on hand and knee, grabbing the one steel rail in order to keep myself from potentially falling over the side, because I have to kick Edward's body over as just to get to roll down over the drop off. Edward had a habit of treating people rather subpar. We did what we felt was necessary.
County 911.
I came home and my roommates weren't home and it looked like there was a fight. My bookshelf was busted, my Xbox controller's ripped out, and my boyfriend's shoes are still under the bed, but he's gone. I don't know what happened.
Okay, you don't know exactly what happened there?
No, his phone's off and I'm really worried.
Blair mentioned there was a mess in the apartment, so I spend my time thinking, like, what the heck's going on?
Okay.
I want a day of peace, and it turns into f***ing anarchy here.
How do you know Blair? How do you know Eddie?
Me and Blair have a friendship. Eddie is her new boyfriend. I've known Eddie for a little while, but I don't know him that much. I'm not an easy guy to get to know. I only have a few friends. I'm kind of brash. I'm kind of out there. I tend to keep to myself because I don't really want many friends. It's kind of how I am.
I'm gonna let you know what we found at the scene. They came across some blood, and then Eddie's missing. One of the neighbors remembers seeing you and Alex there, carrying something large out to the car.
That wasn't anything like that. This is gonna sound like complete crap, but he's got my tools.
What I need you to tell me is why.
Why what?
Why everything happened tonight.
Look, I don't know what you're talking about, okay?
He's gonna start with just flat out denial, which isn't believable. Just because someone's psychopathic does not mean they're intelligent about how to lie well.
But he adds different things that he hopes will make him seem vulnerable and authentic, such as, I know this doesn't sound right, but it's actually the truth. But there's blood everywhere. So it's a careless, impulsive murder with no forethought and no thinking about what would happen.
So, what's your relationship with each one of them?
Edward Hayden is my boyfriend, and Sean Turcott is a friend who lives with me, who is my ex-boyfriend. It's complicated. Well, tell me about today. I unlock the door like usual. I step in. I notice that Sean's still not home yet. And I'm like, where's Eddie? To the left side of the bed, it's a really big stain. And my Xbox controller wires are sticking out. And it kind of made me think, could Sean really do something to Eddie? He can be spontaneously violent, but I don't see him as someone who could commit murder. But I don't know anything anymore. That one time he choked me was terrifying. When you were looking at him, how did he look?
Like he wanted to kill me.
Being choked is a sign of extreme danger. It was happening after they broke up. He feels she doesn't have any right to break up the relationship, and he chokes her because he feels that she's betraying him. He feels entitled because he owns her.
So Sean got kicked out of his ex-girlfriend's house, and I decided to let him move in. And he's been very faithful with the rent. Mostly living situations between the three of us are quite tame.
The word mostly, it's a very telling term, which means there's a story there. Because it's mostly tame, which means it's not always tame. Here are some excerpts from her diary. Blair writes, "Sean makes me so mad since he moved in. He can be such a jerk sometimes. He needs to change his damn attitude, stop snapping at me for stuff he did." To the police, she's minimizing how tempestuous the relationship was in the household. He's snapping at her, and we know that he choked her. This blaming other people or externalizing responsibility is one of the signs that we see in psychopathy.
How's Sean holding up?
I don't know. I haven't spoken to Sean. Do you have any medical issues that would prevent you from remembering certain things like this that we're talking about today?
I have ADHD and Asperger's.
Something happened to Eddie tonight, and I think you and Sean and Blair know a lot more than what you're telling us.
Sean's trying to stay out of their crap. Sean's ulcer was partially because of stress pertaining to Eddie.
I don't doubt that one bit.
Sean and I, over the years, have done our damnedest to do the right thing by other people and keep getting screwed over. When Sean and I were in middle school and high school together, no one gave a damn enough to do anything. I don't know if you believe in past life regression. He and I have gone way back. When I'm going on this trip, he and I actually treaded during those events over 2,000 years. That's how strong our friendship is. And it's been tested in the blood of war.
Alex has very clear characteristics of autism spectrum disorder. You can see it in his language. He's very pedantic, he's very exact. Alex has a limited understanding of friendships and empathy, and he thinks Sean is his best friend for thousands of years. And the way that these two come together is a recipe for disaster. Sean's psychopathic traits are going to make him very quick to exploit the weaknesses in other people and figure out how he can use them to his own advantage.
Can you just tell me yes or no, do you know where Eddie's at right now?
That was the only way to get the abuse to end.
Okay, I get that.
He is not among the living. Sean and I were doing this because we felt it was what had to be done. I want what's best for Sean. His own family disowned him at age 5. His PTSD is worse than mine. Anytime he tries to make one step forward, someone has to slap him right back down. Eddie was actually, in a way, killing Sean. And I don't want him to die.
His identity is fused with Sean Turcotte. Psychologically and emotionally, it sounds like he accepted the idea that seeing Eddie alive was killing Sean, so helping them get rid of Eddie would help Sean live.
He seems so completely under the spell of Turcotte, and he has internalized Turcotte's self-pity, blame the world narrative, which is a very psychopathic and batterer narrative. It really feels like a cult leader and a cult follower type of relationship. And so there's a element of brainwashing, loyalty, devotion, and willingness to commit crime for him.
The plan originally was that Eddie would be asleep. It turned out he wasn't. He was up gaming. So we tried to change things on the fly. I've got the knife in my right hand.
That's how it
right, plunged into the side of his neck.
And then Sean is doing what?
He's swinging with the mallet.
He's really convinced that Sean is a victim. The evidence that he brings up that convinces him is so childlike and false and weak and has no solid foundation. But to him, it's really true. And which tells us a little bit about the childlikeness of his mind, for example. He's also really convinced that if you suffer, you have to do something about it. And that you do whatever you need to do in order to keep your friend alive. And so I think he is demonstrating first the quality of the bond, how tightly bonded he is, and how loyal he is. It has a little bit the flavor of Stockholm Syndrome or brainwashing.
I've already talked to Blair.
I know.
And I've already talked to Alex.
I'm going to tell you, and you, sir, for the record, I did not kill Eddie.
Well, what happened to Eddie then?
I came back home, and he's been really weird lately, okay? He killed himself. And if you knew Blair, you'd know that you'd never have any money. That woman will drain you dry. His paychecks not only go to his son for child support, but for her selfish needs. I tried getting this man to leave because I saw how much pain he was in. The man was hurt.
He is now framing things differently. He doesn't have aggression towards Eddie. I didn't hate him. I actually liked him. He's my friend. I felt sorry for him. Psychopathic people, they will try and shift blame to someone else. So he's shifting it to his ex. And he's lying, but he's really trying now to manipulate the circumstances so that he can come out and look good.
I came back. There was a laceration in his neck. He was dead on the floor when I saw that. And me and Alex panicked. We freaked.
What do you do next?
And as up as it sounds, we wrapped him up. We dumped him. I should have just called you guys and said, look, this guy killed himself. But I didn't. I panicked.
A little over a week before Eddie was murdered, Sean sent a message to a friend on social media. She loves hurting me, and so does Eddie. I would love to take him out in the woods and hunt him like the pig he is. And then he writes, I simply want to kidnap him and kill him at Rock State Park. Take him out to Allegheny Forest and dump his cold dead corpse in the roaring waters so the sharks can eat him. It isn't just a vague thought of killing him. He's actually now articulating a plan for committing murder. He's describing the location of where the body is in fact found. So it's not smart, but he's not even ashamed of his feelings. These are signs that we see in psychopathy.
Mind you, I'm not in the right state of mind because of living with these two. Can you only imagine what would happen if she found him like that? She would blame me in a heartbeat.
Alex and you were tight. Why would
Yes.
he say that you guys killed him?
It's because he has a deep-seated rage thing.
So Alex killed him for you?
Alex didn't kill him. This dude killed himself. Don't ask me how. He had a knife in his neck. This guy had some serious problems. He kept complaining about money. Now, I remember being in that position, but I'm not a suicidal or homicidal person at all. Eddie had a death wish.
When Sean Turcotte's making these comments, we're really learning more about him because we know that he attributes blame to other people. He attributes emotional states to other people. And so it's possible that he himself experiences a death wish. But he'll say anything right now to keep diverting the police officer's attention to somebody else in order to still appear like he's the victim in the story right now.
Look, I'm not a bright person. I'm not very smart. I always have problems, but I'm not capable of doing something like this. And I'm not gonna lie, I didn't like Eddie. I chuckled a little. But I would have never hurt that man. We got into a scuffle for a little bit, but I wanted bygones to be bygones. I wanted to save my money and leave. I didn't want to live there anymore. I lived on a broken futon. And I don't know how to deal with death very well, I really don't. And I'm sorry for sounding really uptight and angry, but I don't know how else to explain this.
I believe Alex's story. I believe the neighbor's story. When I get the body out of the water and I find dagger marks elsewhere, then that's going to make the story even more believable.
You know what? I'm going to tell you the truth. He did it. Alex killed him.
Did he kill him for you?
He did. He's my best friend and would do anything in the world for me.
He had recruited a friend who would do anything for him and manipulated him to help him get it done. And then is willing to throw him under the bus, which lets you see the lack of empathy, the lack of a genuine bond. There's no regard even for Alex's feelings. He'll ditch his friend right away.
Psychopaths really want to use people as chess pieces in the game of life. That's how they see other people. If they can't get around them, they need to move them out of the way with force.
Alex stabbed him in the neck.
Where?
I think in the back of his neck or something. I really wasn't paying attention. I was too horrified watching the blood. That man helped me every step of the way, and not just with that. I've been stepped on my whole life. If I had a chance to talk to Alex right now, I'd tell him I'm sorry. And if he punched me in the face, I'd take it like a man. He's my best friend. He's the only friend I've ever had.
I'm not buying that emotion that he just had there when he says he's the only friend I've ever had. He has kind of a crack in his voice, but he's really crafty in that he's probably able to hold it under this facade of being a good guy.
I didn't want him to use the damn thing. I said, here, Alex, because I wanted him to crack him on the skull to get him to talk.
What did you want him to talk about?
I wanted him to stop using Blair. Blair doesn't stand up for herself. She's like my mom. She gets constantly railroaded by my dad. But I don't have it in me to hit anybody. Me and my dad used to get into fights and he'd lay me out. He's an ex-army.
I think he's explaining in a very honest way, even if it's immature, why he feels he needs to protect Blair. The way he idealizes and devalues particularly Blair, but also interestingly Eddie, are very much part of how he splits into good and bad. She's horrible and manipulative, so the boyfriend needs to go. Other times, she doesn't stand up for herself, like my mother, and so I need to do it for her. We don't know the full story, and we only know what Sean Turcotte says, but this kind of splitting, meaning idolizing and then devaluing the person based on your emotional turmoil, is almost always because of abuse.
And I've always cared about Blair. I've always loved her. Me and Blair have a friendship. We used to have a relationship. We had a daughter in 2010. We weren't ready to have a kid. We went to an adoption agency and we gave her up for adoption. But the grief drove us apart. That woman has every right to hate my guts. She already sees me as a monster for us getting rid of our daughter. I did what my father couldn't do. I made us do the right thing for our child's future before our own. Did that screw us up? Yeah.
The story that he tells only emphasizes his nobility. He couldn't possibly have been a decent father. He's a violent man who is financially unstable. But the abuse he suffered doesn't justify the terrible way he treats women or the fact that he murdered his girlfriend's boyfriend.
My friend Sean getting severe ulcers from the stress of these environments and the torment he and I went through growing up. It was slowly killing him, having to deal with this. I wish it didn't have to turn out this way for this mess to occur.
The phone rings just after midnight, sharp and insistent, the kind of sound that slices through sleep and leaves the room colder than it was a second before, and on the other end is a voice that doesn't tremble, doesn't rush, doesn't ask for forgiveness, only says a name, a date, a place. And then the sentence that has been waiting 30 years to exist, I did it. In Ohio, winter has a way of preserving things, freezing moments in place, and in 1995 this town learned how silence can harden, how unanswered questions can sink into the walls of houses and stay there, breathing, watching, waiting. Back then, the road was dark and empty, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through cornfields stripped bare by November winds, the kind of night where headlights feel like the only moving things in the world, and when a car was found, engine cold, door ajar, radio still tuned to a local station. The music playing softly to no one. The word cold case didn't exist yet, but its shadow was already forming. She was supposed to be home before 10. Everyone remembers that detail because it's the kind of rule parents repeat without thinking, the kind of boundary that feels permanent until the night it's crossed. The porch light stayed on. The coffee went untouched the next morning. The house filled with that specific quiet that only arrives when someone doesn't come back. Neighbors gathered in small knots, coats pulled tight, voices low, trading half-facts and guesses that sounded wrong even as they were spoken. A missing person poster went up at the gas station, then another at the grocery store, her face copied and recopied until the ink faded, eyes staring out from corkboards and telephone poles, as if asking the same question the town was asking itself. How does someone disappear here, of all places? Police walked the ditch lines, their boots sinking into mud softened by thawing frost. They marked tire tracks that led nowhere, bagged cigarette butts that meant nothing, photographed footprints already collapsing back into the earth. The first press conference was cautious, measured, full of phrases like ongoing investigation and no sign of foul play, but behind the microphones, officers traded looks that said otherwise. There was no sign of a struggle, no blood, no broken glass, just absence, and absence is the hardest thing to measure. Friends were interviewed, co-workers, ex-boyfriends, people who hadn't spoken to her in years, but still remembered the sound of her laugh. Alibis stacked up neatly, too neatly, each one closing a door that led to another hallway of questions. Days turned into weeks. Search dogs lost the scent at the edge of the road. Helicopters traced slow circles over fields that looked endless from above. A man called in a tip about a scream he thought he heard, but it turned out to be a fox. Another swore he saw her at a rest stop 2 counties over, but the camera footage was grainy and unhelpful, a blur of faces passing through light and shadow. The word mystery crept into headlines, then the heavier phrase, the one that makes communities flinch, cold case. It was spoken quietly at first, like a superstition, as if saying it too loudly might make it real. Inside the station, boxes began to multiply. Statements, photos, maps with red circles and handwritten notes, timelines that ended in blank space. Detectives rotated off the case, reassigned, promoted, retired. New ones took their place, reading old reports, underlining the same sentences, asking the same questions with fresh voices, and getting the same silence in response. Every few years, something sparked. A tip from out of state. A rumor about a party gone wrong. A name that surfaced and sank again when nothing could be proven. Each time, hope flared and died, leaving behind a deeper exhaustion. The town changed, but not completely. Stores closed. New families moved in. Children who once handed out flyers grew up, moved away, came back for holidays, and still glanced at the road where the car had been found, still lowered their voices when her name came up. For her family, time didn't heal so much as it layered itself on top of the wound. Birthdays marked with candles and silence. Holidays with an empty chair no one ever filled. They learned to live with the questions, to answer reporters politely, to keep one eye on the phone even decades later, just in case. Then came the advances. DNA became a promise whispered in evidence rooms. Old samples were retested, envelopes reopened, hopes recalibrated. A partial match here, an exclusion there. The science moved faster than the truth. Files were digitized. Cold case units formed, then restructured. Grants were written. The case was reviewed again and again and again. Each review ended the same way, with a sigh and a note that read no new leads. Until the call. It didn't come from a lab or a task force. It came from a man who had lived his life in plain sight, who had passed neighbors on sidewalks, nodded at strangers in grocery aisles, paid his bills, raised his voice at football games, and carried a secret that grew heavier with every year he didn't speak. He named the place where it happened, a detail never released to the public. He described the car, the song on the radio, the way the night felt colder than it should have. Investigators listened, pens hovering, the room charged with the electricity of something shifting. Confession is a powerful word, but it's also a fragile one, and every sentence was checked, cross-checked, weighed against what was known and what had been guessed for 3 decades. Evidence was pulled from storage. Dust rose. Boxes were opened. A forgotten item, logged and shelved in 1995, suddenly made sense in the light of a voice speaking at last. Timelines snapped into alignment. A gap filled. A question answered. The announcement came with cameras and careful language. Ohio 1995 cold case closed. Confession ends 30-year mystery. The headline moved fast, ricocheting across screens, shared with disbelief, relief, anger. Some cried. Some shook their heads. Some asked why now? Why after so long? Why after so much silence? But closure is not a clean thing. Even as officials spoke of resolution, of accountability, of a chapter finally ending, another feeling crept in, quieter but persistent. Doubt. People replayed the details, comparing memory to confession, wondering about the years in between. How many times had they stood next to him without knowing? How many chances had there been for the truth to surface earlier? How many small moments could have changed everything? The word cold case may have been struck through in red ink, but its echo remained, humming beneath the celebration, reminding everyone that time doesn't just hide answers, it reshapes them. At the edge of town, the road looks the same. Asphalt. Ditches. Fields stretching toward a flat horizon. Cars still pass at night, headlights cutting tunnels through the dark, radios murmuring to empty seats. For some, the mystery is over. For others, it never will be. Because even when a case is declared closed, the story doesn't stop. It settles into the cracks of memory, into the places where certainty can't reach, leaving behind a question that no confession can fully erase. What does justice mean after 30 years of waiting? Mourning after the announcement doesn't feel like mourning at all. It feels like aftermath, like the air has been shaken and hasn't quite settled back into place. And in this town, people wake up with the same habit they've carried for decades, reaching for the radio, scanning the news, half expecting another correction, another twist, because certainty arrived too quickly and stayed too briefly to feel real. At the diner on Main Street, coffee cups pause midair when his name is spoken, forks hover above plates, and every sentence begins with the same phrase, "Did you hear?" followed by a pause that says more than the words that come next. 30 years of not knowing does something to a place. It trains people to doubt clean endings, and even now, even with a confession on record, the story refuses to sit still. Investigators return to the beginning, not out of nostalgia, but necessity, because a confession without context is just noise, and context is built from old ground. They drive the route again, measure distances that once felt impossible to quantify, stand where the car was found and listen to the wind move through fields that look innocent in daylight and predatory at night. He had said she pulled over. He had said there was an argument. He had said it escalated faster than he expected. Each claim is tested against maps, against weather reports from November 1995, against witness statements that never quite lined up. Some details fit with a satisfying click. Others scrape, resisting, raising eyebrows that have learned to be cautious. Back then, the timeline was a mess of assumptions. She left work at 8:42 p.m., a time clock stamped in fading ink. She stopped for gas, maybe, or didn't. She called a friend, maybe, or planned to. The last confirmed sighting put her on the road just after 9, headlights disappearing toward home. Everything after that was guesswork, stitched together from partial memories and late-night phone calls to police that ended with apologies and embarrassment. Now the confession drops into that fragile structure like a weight, forcing pieces to shift, some settling, some cracking under pressure. The man tells his story in a small room with bad lighting and a table that has heard too many truths too late. He talks about panic, about fear, about a moment that couldn't be taken back. He says he didn't plan it. He says it was an accident. Words investigators have heard before, words that slide easily off the tongue when decades have softened their edges. They ask him to repeat himself. They interrupt. They push. They let silence do its work. When he mentions a detail never released, a specific mark on the road, a sound that carried farther than it should have, someone in the room exhales without realizing it. That's the sound of a door opening. Evidence follows the confession, like a shadow catching up. An item recovered years ago, dismissed as unrelated, suddenly aligns with his account. A fiber, a trace. Something small enough to be overlooked when hope was fresh and resources were stretched thin. Forensic reports are reread with new eyes. What once felt inconclusive now leans toward possibility. It's not perfect. It never is. But it's enough to move the case from the purgatory of unanswered questions into the sharper light of resolution. Outside the station, the community splits along invisible lines. Some embrace the ending, grateful for any form of certainty, eager to believe that the waiting is finally over. Others circle the details, picking at inconsistencies, replaying old rumors that don't quite fit the new narrative. They remember a different suspect, a different theory, a different night. They remember how easy it was to be wrong before. Closure, they say, shouldn't feel this complicated. For the family, the word closure lands heavy and awkward, like a coat that doesn't quite fit. They sit through briefings, nod through explanations, absorb phrases like probable cause and corroborating evidence while their minds drift backward, to a porch light left on, to a room frozen in time. Relief mixes with anger. Validation collides with grief. They learn details they never asked for, images they never wanted, and carry them home like fragile objects they're afraid to drop. Justice, when it comes this late, doesn't arrive with celebration. It arrives quietly, asking to be understood. Reporters revisit old footage. Black and white photos flash across screens, her smile caught in a moment that now feels unbearably distant. The phrase cold case repeats like a refrain, paired with closed, solved, ended, as if repetition can make it true. But language has limits, and the story spills past them. People remember how many times the case had been declared promising before, how many leads had fizzled, how many nights they had locked their doors a little tighter because no one knew what had happened or who was responsible. The man's past is dissected in public view. Where he lived, where he worked, who he dated. Every coincidence becomes a clue in hindsight, every mundane detail recast as potential warning sign. Neighbors speak into microphones, their voices tinged with disbelief. He seemed normal. He was quiet. He was helpful. The familiar litany follows, a reminder that monsters rarely announce themselves, that secrets don't change the shape of a face. Investigators, meanwhile, wrestle with the finality of paperwork. Charges filed. Statements recorded. The case number stamped with a status it has never known before. Closed. It feels ceremonial, almost anticlimactic, the click of a file drawer sliding shut after years of being left open, a small sound to mark something enormous. They know better than anyone that answers don't undo damage, that truth doesn't rewind time, but they also know the cost of not having it, the way unanswered questions metastasize, poisoning everything they touch. As weeks pass, the initial shock fades into something more reflective. Community meetings draw smaller crowds. Conversations shift from what happened to what it means. Schools invite counselors. Churches open their doors. People talk about memory, about guilt, about the strange way time can both heal and conceal. They talk about how a single night in 1995 cast a shadow long enough to reach into the present, shaping decisions, fears, and friendships in ways no one noticed until now. And still, in quiet moments, doubt whispers. Why did it take 30 years? Why now? What changed? The confession answers some questions and sharpens others, leaving a thin line between resolution and uncertainty that no press release can erase. Cold cases don't just end, they linger, their edges frayed, their stories retold with each new generation that inherits the echo. At night, the road remains indifferent. Cars pass, radios play, the fields breathe. Somewhere between what was lost and what was found, the truth settles into the town like a permanent resident, not loud, not dramatic, just present, asking to be lived with. And for those who remember, for those who waited, for those who never stopped wondering, the mystery may be labeled solved, but its weight is still felt, pressing gently but persistently, a reminder that some answers arrive too late to be simple, and some endings never fully let go. The past doesn't stay buried once a confession breathes life into it. It rises in fragments, in overlooked moments, in memories people thought were settled but suddenly feel unstable again. And across Ohio, the year 1995 stops being a date and becomes a place everyone visits whether they want to or not. Investigators spread the files out like a map of a country that no longer exists, tracing borders between what was known then and what is claimed now, and in that overlap they search for the truth that survived 30 years of silence. Every page smells faintly of time, paper yellowed, ink fading, handwritten notes pressing hard enough to leave grooves, the physical weight of a case that refused to disappear even when the world moved on. The confession rewrites the center of gravity. Old suspects, once scrutinized under harsh lights, fade into the background, their names finally allowed to rest. New questions circle the man who spoke, questions about motive, opportunity, and the long, deliberate choice to remain quiet. Detectives examine his life in layers, year by year, mapping where he was when anniversaries came and went, what he did on the dates that mattered to others even _toggle more than him. They look for cracks, for moments where guilt might have surfaced, for slips of behavior that now read differently in hindsight. A missed day of work, a sudden move, a relationship that ended abruptly. Each detail is a thread, and they pull carefully, knowing how easily fabric can tear. Back in 1995, technology was blunt. Calls were traced slowly. Cameras were few and far between. Tips arrived on paper, not screens. The case depended on human memory, a resource both powerful and unreliable. Witnesses described cars that changed color with every retelling, timelines that bent to fit emotion rather than fact. Now, with distance and data, some of those memories are reevaluated. A sighting once dismissed aligns with his route. A noise once explained away matches his description. The puzzle doesn't suddenly become perfect, but its shape sharpens, edges clearer than they were before. The road itself becomes evidence again. Crews photograph it under different light, measure the slope, the shoulder, the way sound carries across open land. He said he stopped there because it felt isolated. Investigators test that assumption, standing where he stood, listening. Cars pass occasionally, enough to remind them that isolation is relative, that risk is calculated in moments, not guarantees. They reconstruct the night with actors and diagrams, not for spectacle but to understand sequence, to pin down the seconds where everything went wrong. The reenactment is clinical, controlled, but it still leaves a chill, the sense of stepping into a moment that should have remained unreachable. The family watches from a distance, offered updates, but spared the worst details unless they ask. They ask some days. Other days they don't. Grief, after 3 decades, has settled into routines and disruption, even in the name of truth, can feel like reopening a scar that had finally stopped aching. They grapple with the idea that the man who confessed carried on with a life, while theirs remained anchored to one night. There is anger in that realization, sharp and sudden, but also exhaustion, the tiredness of having waited so long that emotions blur together. Public opinion swings like a pendulum. Commentators debate the reliability of late confessions, citing cases where false admissions were driven by notoriety or mental decline. Others argue that only someone involved could know the details he shared. Social media dissects transcripts, pauses on single phrases, assigns meaning where there may be none. Armchair investigators resurrect old theories, insisting something doesn't add up, that another person must have been involved, that the truth is still incomplete. The phrase cold case closed is repeated, challenged, defended, becoming less a statement and more a battleground. Inside the legal process, patience replaces urgency. Prosecutors know that time is both ally and enemy, that evidence aged 30 years must be handled with care, its limitations acknowledged without undermining its value. They prepare for defenses that hinge on memory decay, on the absence of physical proof that would have been decisive in 1995. They lean on corroboration, on consistency, on the accumulation of small truths that, together, form a convincing whole. It is a quieter fight than the original search, fought in offices and courtrooms rather than fields and ditches, but its stakes feel just as high. As weeks turn into months, the case reshapes local identity. The town that once introduced itself with schools and sports teams is now linked, inevitably, to a headline. Some resent that. Others embrace it, believing that acknowledgement is better than silence. Memorials are discussed, then debated. Should there be a marker at the roadside, a plaque that says this happened here, remember? Or would that only freeze the town in its worst moment? There is no consensus. Only the shared understanding that forgetting is no longer an option. The man at the center of it all becomes a figure both present and abstract. His face appears on screens, then disappears as attention shifts. He is described by those who knew him, reduced to traits and anecdotes that feel inadequate to explain what he admitted to doing. In custody, he waits, a life narrowed to schedules and procedures, the weight of his words settling into a reality he can no longer control. Whether driven by remorse, fear, or something else entirely, his confession has altered the landscape, and there is no returning it to what it was before. Investigators reflect privately on the years lost. They think about missed chances, about how the case might have unfolded with today's tools, today's awareness. But regret is a luxury the job rarely allows. What matters now is precision, integrity, and the knowledge that even imperfect answers can carry meaning. Closing a cold case is not about erasing the past, it's about acknowledging it fully, without flinching. And still, late at night, questions surface. Could it have been prevented?
Could someone have spoken sooner?
Could a different choice have changed the outcome? These questions drift through the community like fog, not demanding answers, just existing, reminders of vulnerability and consequence. The road remains unchanged, but those who pass it know what it holds, the memory of a moment when ordinary life fractured and left a mark that no amount of time could fully smooth over. The case moves forward, methodically, deliberately, carrying with it the weight of 30 years and the expectations of everyone who waited. Whether history will remember it as solved or simply explained is a question that lingers, suspended between fact and feeling. Because in Ohio, in the shadow of 1995, closure is not a single moment, not a headline or a confession, but a process, slow and imperfect, unfolding in real time, asking a community to live with the truth it finally has and the echoes that refuse to fade. Time compresses as the case inches closer to its reckoning, days filled with preparation that feels both urgent and strangely subdued, and in the spaces between official updates the town replays the story again, trying to line up memory with meaning, emotion with evidence. Court dates appear on calendars like landmarks, each one a reminder that the past is no longer safely distant, that it is moving, slowly but inevitably, toward a public accounting. Investigators refine their narratives, stripping away speculation, focusing on what can be proven, knowing that certainty in a cold case is built not from spectacle but from accumulation. They revisit witness statements with new discipline, listening not for drama but for consistency. A neighbor's recollection of a car idling longer than usual, a passerby's memory of headlights cutting across a field at an odd angle. At the time, these details were footnotes, easy to dismiss in the chaos of an early investigation. Now they are weighed carefully, aligned with the confession, tested against reality.
Some fall into place.
Others remain stubbornly out of reach, reminders that even the most thorough inquiry cannot recover everything time has taken. Experts are brought in, voices from outside the community, who can look at the case without the weight of shared history. They analyze the language of the confession, its cadence, its specificity. They compare it to known patterns, to cases where truth emerged late and to others where it never did. Their conclusions are cautious, framed in probabilities rather than absolutes. This is not television. There is no dramatic reveal, only careful assessment, the slow grind of professional skepticism working in service of clarity. The family prepares in their own way. They are briefed on procedures, on what to expect if the case goes to trial, on the possibility that it may not unfold as neatly as anyone hopes. They practice saying her name out loud in rooms filled with strangers, a simple act that still carries weight. For years, her story belonged to rumors and headlines. Now it is theirs again, spoken in their voices, shaped by their memories, anchored in love rather than speculation. As the legal process advances, the community feels the strain of attention. Reporters return, setting up cameras in familiar spots, asking questions that feel both necessary and invasive. Residents navigate the line between cooperation and fatigue, wanting the truth to be known but wary of being reduced to background scenery in a national narrative. They have lived with this story quietly for decades, and its sudden amplification feels jarring, like a private conversation broadcast too loudly. The man who confessed remains largely silent now, his earlier words echoing louder in their absence. Attorneys speak for him, framing the narrative in terms of accountability and context, careful not to promise more than the law can deliver. Speculation fills the void, theories multiplying in online forums, each one claiming to see what others miss. The case, once starved of information, now threatens to drown in it. Investigators counter that noise with restraint. They focus on chain of custody, on ensuring that every piece of evidence can withstand scrutiny. They know the defense will probe for weaknesses, for gaps created by time, for moments where procedure fell short of today's standards. They prepare responses that are factual, unemotional, grounded in the reality of 1995 policing. This is not an apology for the past, but an acknowledgement of its limits. In quiet moments, some officers revisit the night it began, not through files, but through memory. They remember the exhaustion, the cold, the feeling that something important was slipping away even as they searched. They carry a private relief that the case has not been forgotten, that their early efforts, imperfect as they were, mattered enough to be returned to. Resolution, even delayed, validates the instinct that kept the case alive. The town debates how to mark the moment. Vigils are proposed, then postponed. There is talk of a gathering at the roadside, of candles and silence. Some support it, seeing value in collective acknowledgement. Others resist, wary of reopening wounds or turning tragedy into ritual. The conversation itself becomes part of the process, evidence of a community negotiating how to hold its past without being defined by it. As the story moves toward a courtroom, its tone shifts subtly. The raw shock of confession gives way to a steadier, more deliberate rhythm. This is the phase where emotions are cataloged, where narratives are refined, where the messy reality of a human life lost collides with the structured demands of law. It is less dramatic than the search, less explosive than the revelation, but no less consequential. At night, the familiar sounds return. Trains in the distance, wind through trees, cars passing on the road that started it all. For years, those sounds carried an undercurrent of fear, the unspoken question of who might be responsible. Now they carry something different, a tentative sense of knowing, accompanied by the awareness that knowing does not undo. The town listens differently, alert not to danger, but to memory. The case continues forward, each step measured, each decision weighed against the weight of 30 years. Whether the final outcome will satisfy everyone is uncertain. What is certain is that the story has entered a new phase, one where silence is no longer the dominant force. The cold case, once defined by absence, is now defined by presence, by voices speaking at last, by a truth that demands to be examined in full view, even as it resists easy conclusions. The courtroom breathes differently than the town outside it, air heavy with anticipation, the kind that presses against the chest and makes every movement feel deliberate, and when the doors open, people file in with the quiet awareness that they are about to watch the past speak out loud. Wood benches creak. Papers shuffle. The seal on the wall looks older than it did yesterday. This is where stories are forced into order, where memory must submit to sequence, and where a cold case, long defined by what could not be said, is asked to speak clearly at last. The prosecution begins without drama, laying out a timeline that feels familiar, yet newly sharpened, dates and times aligned like teeth in a zipper finally pulled straight. They talk about 1995 as if it were both distant and immediate, a year that still breathes through evidence and testimony. They describe the road, the car, the night air, anchoring abstract facts to physical places the jury can imagine. Each detail is intentional, chosen not for shock but for clarity, because clarity is the currency of credibility. Witnesses take the stand, some older now, voices altered by time. They recount moments that once seemed insignificant, now elevated by context. A car scene where it didn't belong. A sound that lingered too long. Their memories are imperfect, openly so, and the honesty of that imperfection carries weight. They do not claim certainty, only recollection, and the room leans in, understanding that memory, even flawed, can still point toward truth. Then the confession enters the room, not as a single explosive moment, but as a careful reading, phrases introduced with caution, supported by corroboration. Investigators explain how details unknown to the public were provided unprompted, how the narrative aligned with physical evidence preserved across decades. They acknowledge the gaps, the places where time eroded certainty, and explain how those gaps were bridged not by assumption, but by convergence. The message is subtle but firm. This is not belief. It is construction. The defense responds with restraint, aware of the emotional terrain they're navigating. They question the reliability of a confession given so late, suggest alternative interpretations, emphasize the fragility of evidence aged 30 years. They speak of memory decay, of confirmation bias, of the human tendency to find patterns where none exist. Their tone is measured, almost academic, and in that calm lies their strategy, to slow the momentum, to remind a room that doubt is not only allowed but required. The man at the center of it all sits still, expression guarded, eyes occasionally lifting, then returning to the table.
He does not speak.
His silence feels heavier now than it did before, filled with words already given and consequences still unfolding. Observers search his face for clues, for remorse, for something definitive, but faces rarely provide answers, and this one remains opaque, resisting interpretation. For the family, every minute stretches. They listen to their loved one's name spoken in formal tones, stripped of familiarity, and feel the tension between recognition and loss. This is not the reunion they imagined in their earliest hopes, not the resolution they dreamed of during years of waiting, but it is a form of acknowledgement, and that carries its own gravity. They hold onto each other, absorbing the weight of public truth layered over private grief. Outside, the town follows along in fragments, headlines updating, social feeds filling with commentary. Opinions harden quickly, dividing lines drawn by instinct rather than evidence. Some declare justice already served. Others insist questions remain unanswered. The case becomes a mirror, reflecting how different people process uncertainty, how comfort and skepticism coexist uneasily in the face of tragedy. As days of testimony unfold, a pattern emerges, not of spectacle, but of persistence. The prosecution returns again and again to consistency, to the way independent elements align without forcing. The defense returns to uncertainty, to the idea that alignment does not equal causation. The jury listens, taking notes, weighing credibility in silence. Their task is enormous, to compress 30 years of complexity into a single decision, to translate history into verdict. Evenings bring exhaustion. Participants leave the courtroom into fading light, carrying fragments of the day with them. Conversations are hushed, thoughtful, stripped of earlier bravado. The town feels suspended, caught between what it was and what it may become depending on the outcome. No one knows exactly how this will end, only that it is ending in public, under scrutiny, with consequences that will ripple outward. The road remains unchanged, a constant presence beyond the courtroom walls. It does not testify. It does not accuse. It simply exists, holding its memories without commentary. For years, it was a symbol of mystery. Now it is a silent witness to process, to the slow, methodical attempt to transform a cold case into something warmer, something closer to understanding. As the trial moves forward, tension builds not from surprise but from inevitability. The story has been told as fully as it can be, its edges worn smooth by repetition and examination. What remains is judgment, the moment when listening turns into decision. In that pause, heavy and electric, the town holds its breath, aware that whatever comes next will not change the past, but will define how the past is carried into the future. The waiting becomes its own chapter, thick and uncomfortable, the kind that stretches minutes into something elastic and unreal, and inside the courthouse time seems to move at a different speed, slowing to a crawl as the jury disappears behind closed doors. Outside, people check their phones without reading, sip coffee without tasting it, replay testimony in their minds as if repetition might bend the outcome. 30 years of uncertainty has trained this town to live in suspense, but this is a new kind, sharpened by proximity, by the knowledge that an answer now exists somewhere, being debated in a quiet room. Inside deliberations, the case is reduced to essentials. No headlines, no commentary, just evidence, words, impressions. Jurors revisit the confession line by line, weighing specificity against possibility, asking themselves whether knowledge could have been acquired secondhand, whether coincidence can masquerade as truth. They argue respectfully, voices rising and falling, the gravity of their task evident in the way silence settles after each point is made. This is not a puzzle to be solved quickly, but a responsibility to be carried carefully. They examine the corroboration, the way independent details intersect. The road, the timing, the object recovered years ago that now finds its place. They discuss the gaps openly, the spaces where certainty thins and inference steps in. They acknowledge discomfort, the unease of deciding a case so old, where memories blur and evidence has aged alongside the people who collected it. Doubt is not dismissed. It is examined, turned over, tested against reason. Beyond the courthouse, the town holds vigil without candles. Conversations drift toward reflection, toward the cost of not knowing and the price of knowing too late. Older residents recall the early days, the searches, the rumors that flourished in absence of answers. Younger ones listen, realizing how deeply the case shaped a place they thought they understood. The story has become communal property, shared across generations, binding them through a moment none of them can change. When the jury returns, the room tightens. Chairs shift. Breath is held. The verdict is read in a voice that aims for neutrality, but carries the weight of finality.
Guilty.
The word lands with a dull heaviness, not explosive, not triumphant, but definitive. It settles into the room like dust after a long collapse, altering the shape of everything it touches. Reaction ripples outward. Some close their eyes. Some nod slowly. Some stare straight ahead, absorbing the sound of a decision that ends a chapter, but not the story. The man at the center of it all remains composed, face still, as if bracing for a reality he has already rehearsed. There is no outburst, no visible relief, only the quiet acceptance of a consequence long delayed. For the family, the verdict brings a complicated release. Validation mingles with grief, certainty colliding with the knowledge that nothing can restore what was taken. They step outside into sunlight that feels almost intrusive, the world continuing at its usual pace despite the significance of what just occurred. They are offered condolences, words that feel both necessary and insufficient. Justice, when it arrives after decades, does not arrive cleanly. It arrives layered, heavy, and irrevocable. Sentencing is scheduled, another date added to calendars already crowded with emotion. Legal language fills the air again, talk of ranges and statutes, of considerations shaped by time past and actions taken. The cold case is officially no longer cold, transformed by a verdict into something resolved on paper, even as its emotional temperature remains unsettled. Media coverage spikes, then begins to taper. The headline changes slightly, adding conviction, replacing mystery with outcome. Yet interest persists, fueled by the rarity of such endings, by the fascination with truth emerging so late. Analysts dissect the trial, highlight moments, debate implications for other cold cases waiting in storage rooms across the country. In quieter spaces, officers reflect on the journey. They think about the years when the case was nothing but a file, a weight carried without expectation of resolution. The verdict affirms the value of persistence, of keeping questions alive even when answers seem unreachable. It also underscores the limits of justice, the way time complicates accountability, blurs lines that once seemed sharp. As evening falls, the town exhales. Not in celebration, but in acknowledgement. The waiting has changed form, replaced by the task of integration, of learning how to live with an answer after so long without one. The road still exists, unchanged and unremarkable to those passing through, but for those who know, it holds a new meaning now, no longer just a site of loss, but a marker of a journey that spanned 3 decades and finally, at great cost, found its end. And yet, even in the shadow of a verdict, questions linger about why it took so long, about what might have been different, about the silent years between the night everything changed and the moment accountability arrived. These questions do not demand resolution. They exist as reminders, etched into the collective memory, ensuring that even as the case is closed, its lessons remain open, echoing quietly through the town and beyond. Sentencing day arrives without drama, no thunder, no sudden shift in the sky, Just another morning that feels heavier than it should, and in that weight the town recognizes a familiar sensation, the gravity that has followed this case for as long as anyone can remember. The courtroom fills again, quieter this time, the energy less volatile, more resigned, as if everyone understands that this is not about revelation but consequence. The verdict has spoken. Now the law gives it shape. The judge reviews the facts with deliberate care, acknowledging the passage of time, the harm done, the years stolen from a family and a community. Legal language moves slowly, deliberately, each phrase carrying the burden of finality. The confession is referenced not as a dramatic turning point, but as a factual element, one piece in a chain that led here. There is no rewriting of history, no softening of edges, only recognition of responsibility long deferred. When the sentence is announced, it lands with a quiet inevitability. There is no gasp, no visible shock, just a collective stillness as the number of years is spoken aloud, transforming abstraction into reality. The man listens, expression unchanged, absorbing the sound of a future now defined by limits. Whatever his reasons for speaking after 3 decades, they have led him here, to a moment where words can no longer alter outcome. The family is offered a chance to speak. They do not perform grief. They do not raise their voices. They speak plainly about absence, about birthdays marked by silence, about a life that continued with a permanent gap. Their words cut through the room precisely because they are restrained, grounded in lived experience rather than rhetoric. They do not ask for vengeance. They ask for acknowledgement. In that request, the room feels smaller, more intimate, as if everyone present is being addressed directly. Outside, cameras wait, but the statements given are brief. There is relief, yes, but it is cautious, shaped by the knowledge that nothing can restore what was lost. Reporters note the lack of triumph, the subdued tone, the way closure seems less like a door slamming shut and more like a heavy weight finally set down. The phrase "cold case closed" is repeated again, but now it sounds different, less sensational, more descriptive. In the days that follow, the story recedes from the front page, replaced by newer crises, newer mysteries. Yet locally, its impact deepens. Conversations shift from what happened to what it has taught. Parents talk to children about choices, about accountability, about how ordinary lives can intersect with irreversible consequences. Teachers reference the case in lessons about law and ethics, careful to emphasize humanity over spectacle. For investigators, the work winds down in practical ways. Evidence is cataloged for long-term storage. Files are archived with final annotations. A case that once demanded constant attention now settles into a status that feels almost unreal. Some officers feel a strange emptiness, the absence of a question that once occupied so much mental space. Others feel a quiet pride, not in the outcome, but in the persistence that kept the case alive until it could be answered. The road becomes a place people visit deliberately now, not out of fear or curiosity, but reflection. Flowers appear, then fade. Someone leaves a handwritten note, words blurred by rain. There is no official memorial, no ceremony, just small, personal gestures that speak to the need for connection. The place itself remains unchanged, but the way it is seen has shifted, transformed by knowledge. The man begins his sentence in a facility far from the fields and roads that once defined his life. He becomes a number, a routine, a case study in delayed accountability. His confession is cited in training sessions, in discussions about cold cases and the psychology of guilt. Analysts debate what finally compelled him to speak, whether remorse grows louder with age or fear sharpens as time narrows. There is no definitive answer, only speculation layered on fact. As months pass, the town adjusts. The case no longer dominates conversation, but it surfaces unexpectedly, triggered by a song on the radio, a stretch of road at dusk, an anniversary that still carries weight. These moments are quieter now, less charged, but no less real. Closure, it turns out, is not a finish line but a recalibration, a way of learning to live with answers after decades of uncertainty. The cold case, once a symbol of absence, becomes a reference point, a reminder that truth can emerge even after long silence, but that its arrival is rarely clean or complete. It leaves behind lessons about patience, about the limits of justice, about the resilience of those who wait. And in Ohio, in the long shadow of 1995, life continues, shaped subtly but permanently by a story that refused to stay buried and finally, at great cost, found its voice. After the sentence is handed down, the noise fades, not all at once, but in layers, like a city after a storm, and what's left behind is something quieter and harder to name. The courthouse empties. The microphones are packed away. The last official statements are filed. On paper, the case has reached its end, but endings are rarely silent, and in this town the silence carries echoes that refuse to dissipate. People begin to notice how often the story still surfaces in their thoughts, how resolution does not erase habit, only reshapes it. Investigators return to ordinary work, new files stacked on desks, new names replacing old ones, but the Ohio 1995 cold case lingers in conversation, referenced in shorthand, a shared point of understanding. It becomes a benchmark, the case that reminds them why persistence matters, why evidence is never truly obsolete, why unanswered questions should never be treated as expendable. Younger officers ask about it, wanting to know what it felt like to close something so old. The answers vary, but they share a theme: satisfaction tempered by humility, pride restrained by the knowledge of what was lost. The family retreats from public view, reclaiming privacy after months of exposure. They visit places they avoided for years, not out of obligation but choice. The road, once unbearable, becomes tolerable, then reflective. They stand there briefly, not searching for meaning, just acknowledging that this place no longer holds power over them the way it once did. Healing doesn't arrive in a rush. It arrives in small permissions, allowing themselves to think forward without guilt. Across town, opinions settle into quieter forms. The arguments soften. Certainty gives way to acceptance, even among those who once doubted. The confession, the verdict, the sentence, together they form a narrative that, while imperfect, feels complete enough to carry. People stop asking what really happened and start asking how they lived with not knowing for so long. The case becomes less about crime and more about endurance, about the psychological cost of uncertainties stretched across decades. National attention shifts elsewhere, but the case finds a second life in professional circles. Cold case units reference it in training, emphasizing the importance of preservation, of patience, of listening carefully when the past finally speaks. Analysts point to the confession as an example of delayed accountability, a reminder that guilt does not always surface under pressure, but sometimes under time. The story is retold in classrooms and conferences, stripped of sensationalism, focused instead on process and consequence. The man serves his time quietly, his name appearing occasionally in reports, then less frequently as years pass. He is no longer the center of the story, just a part of it, a chapter that does not need revisiting to remain understood. Speculation about his motives fades, replaced by a simpler acknowledgement. He spoke, and the truth followed as closely as it could. Whatever remained unsaid belongs to history now, not investigation. Seasons cycle through the town, marking anniversaries without ceremony. The date that once triggered fear and speculation now arrives with muted recognition, a line in the calendar that carries weight but no longer dictates behavior. The cold case has altered the town's rhythm permanently, but subtly, like a scar that aches less with time, yet never fully disappears. There are moments, still, when someone pauses at the mention of 1995, when a conversation dips into silence before moving on. These moments are no longer charged with dread. They are contemplative, reflective, shaped by the understanding that answers, when they come, do not erase the past but clarify it. The mystery that once defined the town has transformed into a lesson, not a warning but a memory. The road remains, indifferent to its history, carrying traffic and weather and time without comment. But those who know the story see it differently now, not as a place of unresolved fear, but as a marker of a long journey, one that began with confusion and ended, imperfectly, with truth. It stands as proof that silence can be broken, that even the coldest cases can change temperature, warmed slightly by persistence and the courage, however late, to speak. And so life continues, not freed from the past, but informed by it. The Ohio 1995 cold case is no longer a question hanging in the air, but a memory grounded in fact, a reminder that time can conceal, but it can also reveal. The town moves forward carrying that knowledge quietly, aware that while the mystery is ended, its impact will always be felt, woven into the fabric of a place that waited 30 years for an answer and learned, in the process, how to live with both the waiting and the truth that finally arrived. Years begin to stack up again, but this time they feel different, lighter somehow, no longer carrying the same unanswered weight, and as distance grows between the town and the trial, reflection takes over where shock once lived. The case settles into collective memory not as an open wound, but as a scar people touch unconsciously, a reminder of what happened and what it cost to finally understand it. Conversations about it become less frequent, but more thoughtful, shaped by perspective rather than urgency. In law enforcement circles, the case quietly changes how old files are treated. Boxes once considered dormant are reopened with renewed respect. Detectives speak about patience not as a virtue but as a strategy, about the importance of preserving even the smallest detail because time, unpredictable as it is, has a way of rearranging significance. The Ohio 1995 cold case becomes a reference point, cited not for its drama, but for its endurance, a reminder that answers do not always arrive when they are most needed, but when they are finally possible. The family continues the slow work of redefining normal. They reclaim traditions that once felt interrupted, create new ones that acknowledge the past without being trapped by it. There are moments of unexpected emotion, triggered by trivial things, a photograph found in a drawer, a familiar stretch of road glimpsed from a car window. But these moments no longer feel overwhelming. They are absorbed, processed, allowed to pass. Knowing the truth, even a painful one, has given grief a boundary it never had before. In the town, the case influences how people talk about safety, about community responsibility, about noticing the small things that once slipped through the cracks. There is less paranoia now, but more awareness, a subtle shift in how neighbors look out for one another. The lesson is not fear, but attention, the understanding that ordinary places can hold extraordinary consequences, and that silence, prolonged, can shape lives as profoundly as action. The legal system moves on, but the case leaves fingerprints behind. Judges reference it when discussing delayed justice. Attorneys mention it when debating the value of confessions long after the fact. Students study it as an example of how narrative and evidence evolve over time, how certainty is rarely immediate and often constructed piece by piece. The story becomes instructional, its emotional edges softened by distance, its core lessons sharpened by analysis. The man who confessed fades further into the background of public awareness. His name surfaces rarely, usually in footnotes or comparisons, his identity reduced to function rather than notoriety. The focus shifts away from him and toward the broader implications of his choice to speak. Discussions center on accountability, on whether confession is an act of courage, guilt, or inevitability. No single answer satisfies, and perhaps none is meant to. Anniversaries pass quietly now. The date that once froze the town in collective memory arrives and leaves with little fanfare. Those who remember pause briefly, then continue with their day. This, too, is a form of healing, the ability to acknowledge without being overtaken. The cold case has lost its grip on the present, even as it remains firmly rooted in the past. The road, unchanged and unremarkable to outsiders, still carries its quiet symbolism. It has become a place people mention rather than avoid, a location woven into stories told with calm voices rather than hushed tones. Its meaning has shifted from threat to testament, proof that places can witness tragedy without being defined by it forever. Looking back, The town recognizes how profoundly uncertainty shaped it, how years of not knowing influenced behavior, relationships, even identity. The resolution did not erase that history, but it reframed it, allowing people to understand their own resilience, the way they adapted, endured, and waited. The cold case is no longer a question mark looming over everything. It is a period at the end of a long, painful sentence. And yet, beneath that period, there is still an echo, not of fear, but of awareness. A recognition that truth can hide in plain sight, that time does not guarantee justice, only opportunity. The Ohio 1995 cold case stands as a reminder that while answers can arrive late, their impact can still be profound, reshaping memory, redefining closure, and leaving behind a quieter, steadier understanding of what it means to finally know. With distance comes reinterpretation, the subtle reordering of meaning that only time allows, and as the case drifts further from the present, it begins to live less as an event and more as a reference, a quiet marker people return to when trying to explain why certain instincts never fully faded. The town doesn't talk about it every day anymore, but when it does, the tone is different, steadier, stripped of urgency, shaped by the understanding that the worst part is no longer the not knowing. New generations grow up hearing fragments, not rumors but facts, told without fear, contextualized rather than whispered. Teachers mention it in history units about the 1990s. Parents explain it as something that happened before, something that changed how people thought about safety and responsibility. The story becomes educational rather than traumatic, its sharpest edges dulled by explanation, its significance preserved through careful telling. In law enforcement, the ripple effects continue quietly. Protocols evolve. Evidence retention policies tighten. There is a renewed emphasis on documentation, on assuming that every case may one day be reopened under different circumstances, different technologies, different social pressures. The Ohio 1995 cold case is invoked not as an anomaly, but as proof that closure is not bound by time limits, only by persistence and opportunity. For those who lived through the original disappearance, memory remains layered. They remember the fear, the speculation, the way trust thinned during those early months. They also remember how life continued despite it, how routines adapted around an unanswered question. The resolution does not overwrite those memories, but it contextualizes them, giving shape to emotions that once felt unanchored. Knowing what happened does not simplify the past, but it stabilizes it. The family, now further removed from public attention, navigates a quieter landscape of grief and acceptance. They speak her name without hesitation, without the weight of unanswered questions pressing down on every syllable. There is still sorrow, but it is no longer compounded by uncertainty. They describe the resolution not as peace, but as clarity, a word that feels more honest, more precise. Occasionally, a documentary crew calls. A podcast producer reaches out. Requests are weighed carefully, often declined. The story has already taken enough. When it is told again, it is done with intention, focused on process and impact rather than shock. The family understands that the case belongs to public record, but their grief does not, and they guard that distinction fiercely. The road continues to serve its ordinary purpose, carrying commuters, deliveries, travelers passing through without awareness. To most, it is just a stretch of pavement. To a few, it remains symbolic, not of danger, but of transition, the place where uncertainty once peaked and eventually gave way to understanding. It stands as a reminder that geography can hold memory, even when nothing about it appears remarkable. Looking outward, the case influences how other cold cases are perceived. There is less resignation, less assumption that time alone guarantees failure. Advocates point to Ohio 1995 when arguing for funding for patients, for the value of revisiting what was once set aside. Families still waiting find cautious hope in its example, understanding that while outcomes cannot be promised, persistence is not futile. The phrase cold case closed, once a headline designed to shock, becomes something quieter, almost clinical, stripped of spectacle. Its meaning matures. It no longer implies celebration, but resolution, the difference between absence and understanding. It signals the end of searching, not the end of impact. As years continue to pass, the case settles fully into history, no longer a living controversy, but a studied example. It reminds those who encounter it that truth is not always timely, that justice is not always swift, and that communities are shaped as much by waiting as by answers. The Ohio 1995 cold case leaves behind no mystery now, but it leaves behind insight, the kind earned slowly, painfully, and at great cost. And in that insight lies the final shift. The story is no longer about what happened on one night decades ago. It is about what followed, about endurance, accountability, and the complicated relief that comes when silence finally breaks. The town carries that understanding forward, quietly, deliberately, aware that while the case is closed, its meaning continues to unfold in the lives it touched and the lessons it left behind. Long after the headlines fade, after the cameras are packed away and the courthouse steps return to silence, the case still breathes in quieter places. It lingers in the pauses of conversation, in the way people lower their voices when they pass certain streets, in the instinctive glance over the shoulder when memory brushes too close to the present. Ohio, 1995, no longer shouts its name, but it hasn't vanished. It hums, low and constant, like an old machine still running in the background. The confession, recorded and archived, becomes a fixed point in an otherwise shifting narrative. Words spoken in a small room, under fluorescent lights, now carry the weight of decades. Analysts replay them, sentence by sentence, searching for certainty in tone and cadence, asking whether truth always sounds the way we expect it to sound. There is relief in those words, yes, but also discomfort. Because a confession can close a case, but it can't rewind time. It can't return what was taken, and it can't fully explain how a life can coexist with silence for so long. In the town, everyday life absorbs the shock and slowly metabolizes it. Children who were not yet born in 1995 walk to school past houses that once hid secrets. They know the story only in fragments, filtered through adults who still struggle to decide how much to say. Teachers mention it cautiously, as history rather than warning, as something that happened before smartphones, before constant surveillance, before the illusion that everything is always recorded. The past feels distant to them, but the unease remains, subtle and inherited. Former suspects carry invisible scars. Years of whispered accusations do not dissolve overnight. Even after official statements clear their names, even after the community nods and moves on, there is a residue that clings. They learn to live with it, to accept that some glances will always last a second too long. Justice, when delayed, leaves uneven footprints. It resolves the legal question, but it doesn't guarantee emotional symmetry. The investigators who revisit the case one last time do so with a strange tenderness. Files are thinner now, reduced to essentials, stripped of speculation. What remains is chronology, evidence, and the undeniable fact of time passing. They see their younger selves in those pages, handwritten notes, outdated terminology, assumptions shaped by an era that believed answers should come quickly or not at all. Ohio 1995 teaches them that patience is not passive. It is active, demanding, and often misunderstood. Nationally, the case slides into a broader conversation about cold cases and delayed justice.
Podcasts dissect it.
Documentaries frame it with ominous music and slow-motion shots of empty roads. Viewers binge, speculate, and move on. For them, it's content. For the people who lived it, it's still memory. There is a gap between those two experiences, and no amount of narration can fully bridge it. What remains most unsettling is not what is known, but what will never be known. The moments between the last sighting and the final act remain a blank space. A void where imagination rushes in, uninvited. Even with a confession, there are details that die with the years. Motives simplify under legal language. Complexity gets sanded down for closure. But reality, as always, resists neat endings. At night, the town settles into familiar rhythms.
Porch lights flick on.
Cars pass. Somewhere, a radio murmurs the news. Life continues, not because the past has been resolved, but because it must. The case has an ending on paper, but its echo stretches forward, shaping how people think about trust, about neighbors, about the thin line between normalcy and revelation. Ohio 1995 no longer asks to be solved. It asks to be remembered accurately. Not as a spectacle, not as a punchline to a mystery finally answered, but as a reminder of how easily time can hide truth, and how heavy that hidden truth becomes the longer it stays buried. The confession closed the file, but it did not close the conversation. It simply changed its tone. And in that quieter tone, stripped of urgency and sirens, the real legacy of the case emerges. A legacy of waiting, of doubt endured, of a community learning, slowly and painfully, that justice is not always about speed or certainty, but about persistence, about the refusal to let silence have the final word. Years later, the case returns not with urgency, but with gravity. It resurfaces in courtrooms during unrelated trials, cited in passing as precedent. A reminder that time does not erase accountability. Lawyers invoke it carefully, knowing its weight. Jurors listen differently when they hear the phrase cold case, as if the words themselves carry a warning that certainty can be delayed, but it is rarely denied forever. In the town, memory reorganizes itself. Streets are repaved, storefronts change names, but certain locations remain emotionally frozen. A bend in the road, a stretch of trees, a house that once stood quiet while questions screamed outside. These places are no longer crime scenes, yet they still interrupt thought. People slow their cars without realizing why. Muscle memory remembers what the mind tries to release. The family, now older, lives with a truth that arrived too late to heal cleanly. Closure, they discover, is not a door that clicks shut. It is a room you learn to stand in without collapsing. The confession gave them answers, but it also reframed their grief. What once felt like endless uncertainty has become something heavier. Knowledge that sat dormant for decades, waiting. Knowing hurts differently than not knowing. It is sharper, more precise. The man who confessed becomes a figure reduced to documents and diagnoses. Psychologists analyze his silence, his ability to blend into ordinary life while carrying a secret dense enough to bend time. They debate whether guilt ages a person faster, whether the body keeps score even when the mouth stays closed. There are no definitive conclusions, only patterns and probabilities. The human mind, like the case itself, resists final explanation. Investigators reflect on what this case changed. Not procedures, not technology, those evolved anyway, but mindset. Ohio 1995 reinforced the idea that unresolved cases are not failures, only unfinished conversations. Detectives begin to treat time as an ally rather than an enemy. Witnesses age. Relationships fracture. Secrets loosen their grip. The waiting, once seen as stagnation, becomes strategy. Media interest flares briefly again, then dims. Each resurgence is smaller than the last. Audiences crave novelty, and the case no longer provides it. There is no chase, no reveal left to dramatize. What remains is aftermath, and aftermath does not trend well. But for those inside the story, aftermath is everything. It is where consequences live. The town holds a quiet understanding now. Not spoken aloud, not formalized. Just a shared recognition that danger does not always announce itself, and that familiarity can be a disguise. This understanding doesn't breed paranoia, but awareness. People listen a little more closely. They pay attention to absences, to patterns, to what feels slightly out of place. As seasons pass, the case settles into history, but not into obscurity. It becomes a reference point, a shared memory that shaped a generation's sense of safety. Parents who grew up under its shadow raised children with subtle caution, passing down instincts rather than fear. The story is no longer told in full. It doesn't need to be. The lesson has already taken root. Ohio 1995 ends not with resolution, but with integration. It folds into the fabric of the community, altering its texture forever. The mystery is gone, but the imprint remains, a reminder that truth can sleep for decades and still wake with force, that silence can stretch across a lifetime, and that when it finally breaks, it doesn't shout. It settles in, quietly, and changes everything that comes after. What happens after the truth arrives is rarely discussed. There are no sirens for the aftermath, no breaking banners for the slow recalibration of lives. The town learns this quietly. Conversations shift from what happened to what now, and that question hangs heavier than expected. Because knowing the end of a story doesn't tell you how to live with it. In small ways, routines change. People stop avoiding certain names. Old rumors lose their edge and fall flat in midair. The silence that once felt charged becomes merely silence again. Ordinary. Almost peaceful. But beneath it, there is a subtle alertness, a shared awareness that normalcy is something constructed, not guaranteed. Ohio 1995 taught them that. The records are finalized, stamped, archived. Digital backups hum in climate-controlled rooms, preserving every scanned page, every time-stamped detail. The case is technically finished, but its data lives on, ready to be summoned at any moment. In an age obsessed with immediacy, it stands as proof that some answers arrive only when time decides to release them. The family revisits places they once avoided, not for closure, not for ceremony, just to stand there without the weight crushing their chests. The air feels different now. Lighter but thinner too, as if something essential has been removed. Grief, when unresolved, is dense. When resolved, it becomes precise. It no longer fills the room. It points. Community meetings discuss unrelated issues, schools, budgets, zoning, but the case echoes in how people speak. There is less certainty, more listening. Fewer absolutes. When someone says we'll know soon, others nod but don't expect it. Ohio 1995 rewired expectations. It taught patience the hard way. Experts continue to argue over the confession. Not its validity that is settled, but its psychology. Why then? Why not earlier? What pressure finally cracked decades of silence? Theories multiply, but none fully satisfy. Because the truest answer may be the simplest. Time ran out. Bodies weaken. Memories blur. The weight of carrying a secret eventually exceeds the fear of releasing it. At night, the town looks like any other. Streetlights. Empty roads. The illusion of quiet permanence. But those who lived through the long uncertainty know better. They know how easily a place can become a question mark, how quickly familiarity can turn into suspicion. This knowledge doesn't paralyze them. It sharpens them. Ohio 1995 is no longer a headline. It's a reference. A low-spoken phrase that carries an entire history in 4 digits. It reminds people that truth doesn't always arrive when it's needed, only when it's ready. And when it doesn't restore what was lost. It redraws the map around the loss. The case has stopped asking for attention. It doesn't need witnesses anymore. Its final form is quieter, heavier, more permanent. A story that ends not with relief, but with understanding. And understanding, once earned, never fully lets go. With time, the case becomes something people carry without realizing it. Not as a burden, but as a calibration. Decisions are made with a slightly longer pause. Trust is offered, but measured. The town doesn't live in fear. It lives with memory, and memory has a way of refining instinct. Ohio 1995 taught them that the absence of answers can be as formative as their arrival. The courthouse, once the stage for speculation and whispered certainty, returns to routine. Files slide across counters. Judges read sentences unrelated to the past. Yet sometimes, a clerk hesitates when shelving an old box, fingers brushing a label that once consumed an entire community. The moment passes. The box goes back. Order is restored. But the knowledge remains that order is always temporary, maintained by attention. The confession's language continues to be parsed in academic circles. Linguists point to pauses, to shifts in pronouns, to the where responsibility is claimed and softened in the same breath. They debate whether truth announces itself differently after decades of concealment. There is no consensus. Only the recognition that time changes the sound of honesty, sanding edges, rearranging emphasis. Those who reported tips years ago, some accurate, many not, reflect privately. A few wonder if they could have done more. Others accept that they did what they could with what they knew. The case reminds them that participation in justice is rarely heroic. It is often hesitant, imperfect, and affected by fear of being wrong. Ohio 1995 forgives none of that, but it explains it. Public spaces absorb the story, without signage. No plaques. No tours. The town resists turning its past into attraction. Instead, remembrance becomes internal, personal. A way of speaking. A way of noticing when someone goes missing from routine. A way of asking questions earlier, even when it feels uncomfortable. The family reaches a fragile equilibrium. Not peace, something more honest. A coexistence with the truth that allows breathing room. They stop marking time by anniversaries and start measuring it by ordinary milestones. Birthdays. Graduations. The future asserts itself, not as replacement, but as continuation. Ohio 1995 no longer demands belief. It has facts. What it asks for now is vigilance. An understanding that closure is not an ending, but a state that requires maintenance. Stories can reopen. Context can shift. New light can recast old shadows. The case stands as evidence of that dynamic tension between finality and reconsideration. As the years stretch forward, the mystery that once defined the town dissolves into a quieter legacy. A shared literacy in waiting. A respect for uncertainty. A refusal to let silence masquerade as resolution. The confession ended the search, but it didn't end the listening. And so the town listens, to itself, to its past, to the subtle signals that ripple beneath ordinary days. Ohio 1995 rests now, not forgotten, not dramatized. Present in the way people move through their lives, aware that truth can be patient, and that when it finally speaks, it changes the shape of everything that follows. Eventually, the case stops being something people talk about and becomes something they understand. Not intellectually, not academically, but instinctively. It settles into the background of decision-making, like a weather pattern learned over years. You don't check the forecast anymore. You just know when a storm might come. New investigators hear the story secondhand, stripped of urgency, but heavy with implication. They study it late at night, alone in offices lit by desk lamps, sensing that this case is not about technique, but endurance. Ohio 1995 doesn't teach how to force answers out of the dark. It teaches how to stay when the dark refuses to speak. The town's relationship with time changes. People become less obsessed with immediacy, less convinced that speed equals truth. When something feels unresolved, they don't rush to fill the gap. They let it sit. They remember what happens when assumptions harden too early. Silence, once feared, becomes a space to be monitored rather than erased. The confession, though legally sufficient, never fully satisfies the emotional math. Some details remain vague. Some answers feel rehearsed, rounded off by age and fatigue. This doesn't reopen the case, but it leaves a residue of awareness. Truth they learn does not always arrive clean. Sometimes it limps in, incomplete, asking to be accepted anyway. Those who lived closest to the center of the storm feel its absence most sharply. When a crisis defines you for decades, its end can feel disorienting. What do you do when the thing that shaped your vigilance is suddenly gone? Ohio 1995 leaves behind not relief, but recalibration. Public memory thins. A generation grows up without the weight of unanswered questions pressing into daily life. Yet the older ones watch carefully, knowing how easily certainty can fracture. They don't tell the story to frighten. They tell it to teach attention. To remind that what is unresolved today may still be alive tomorrow. The case's final lesson reveals itself slowly. Justice is not a moment, but a process that stretches across lives. It borrows time from the future to correct the past. Ohio 1995 took 30 years to speak clearly, and when it did, it altered the trajectory of everyone who had been listening. Nothing dramatic marks this understanding. No final scene. No swelling music. Just the quiet recognition that some stories end by dissolving into the people who lived them. The mystery fades, but the vigilance remains. And in that vigilance, in the pauses, the patience, the refusal to rush to certainty, the true legacy of Ohio 1995 endures. What lingers longest is not the crime, but the silence that followed it. A silence that shaped habits, trained instincts, and rewired how people interpreted absence. When someone didn't show up, when a call went unanswered, when a door stayed closed a little too long, Ohio 1995 whispered in the background. Even now, with the case closed, that whisper hasn't fully disappeared. It has simply changed its meaning. The town learns to live without the constant tension of not knowing, but it doesn't forget what not knowing felt like. That sensation, tight, unresolved, becomes a reference point. A reminder of how fragile certainty is, how quickly normal life can tilt into suspicion.
People don't say this out loud. They don't need to.
It lives in posture, in pauses, in the way eyes linger when something feels off. The confession ages into a historical artifact. No longer debated, no longer sensationalized. It exists as fact, but stripped of drama. Future readers will encounter it without context, without the years of waiting that gave it weight. They'll see a date, a name, a statement. They won't feel the nights that stretched endlessly, the theories that hardened and broke, the emotional fatigue of hope repeatedly deferred. For those who were there, that fatigue was real. It carved deep channels into memory. When the truth finally arrived, it didn't flood those channels. It filled them slowly, cautiously, as if even certainty had learned to be careful. Ohio 1995 didn't explode into resolution. It settled. Some people still ask the question they know has no answer. What if? What if a detail had been noticed earlier? What if someone had spoken sooner? What if time had not been so patient? These questions don't reopen wounds anymore. They exist as thought experiments, reminders of how many outcomes hinge on moments too small to register at the time. The landscape absorbs the past without comment. Fields grow over places once searched inch by inch. Buildings change hands. Trees stand taller. Nature, indifferent to narrative, continues. And yet, for those who remember, the land still carries an imprint. Not visible, not measurable, but felt. Ohio 1995 ultimately becomes a study in endurance, not just of investigators or families, but of a community forced to coexist with uncertainty. It proves that people can adapt to unresolved truth, can build lives around it, can wait decades without surrendering the need for answers. Now that the waiting is over, what remains is something quieter, steadier, a collective understanding that truth has its own pace. That silence is not empty, it's active, concealing, shaping outcomes. And that when silence finally breaks, it doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it just exhales. And in that exhale, Ohio 1995 finds its final form, not as a mystery, not as a headline, but as a permanent lesson etched into the consciousness of those who lived long enough to hear the truth arrive. The story does not end where the file ends. It stretches outward, thinning but never disappearing, like sound traveling long after the source has gone quiet. Long after the confession, long after the last legal formality, the case continues to exist in the spaces between certainty and understanding. It is no longer a problem to be solved. It is a condition to be lived with. There are mornings when the town wakes without remembering it at all. Coffee brews. Doors open. Traffic moves. The past does not announce itself. But then there are other mornings when something small, an anniversary date on a calendar, a name overheard on the radio, a familiar street glimpsed from a different angle, pulls the case back into focus. Not sharply, softly, like an image developing slowly in a darkroom. The people who once waited for answers now wait for something else. Meaning, perhaps. or alignment. They know the truth, but truth is only the skeleton of a story. Flesh comes later. Emotion, interpretation, memory. Those take longer. Ohio 1995 closed the question of who, but it left behind the question of what it all did to the people who lived under its shadow. The town's elders speak of the years differently now. Before the confession, time felt stalled, trapped in repetition. Each year was another loop around the same unanswered question. Afterward, time resumes its forward motion, but with a different texture. Less naive, more deliberate. People notice how long things take, how much patience is required for anything real to surface. Some residents begin volunteering with missing persons organizations quietly, without tying their motivation to the past. Others attend council meetings they once avoided, unwilling to disengage again. Civic life gains a subtle seriousness, not urgency, responsibility. Ohio 1995 did not radicalize the town. It grounded it. The investigators who remained closest to the case feel its absence like phantom pain. For decades, the mystery structured their thinking, their instincts, their sense of professional purpose. When it finally resolves, there is relief, but also loss. A strange one. The kind that follows any long pursuit. The target is gone, and suddenly you have to decide who you are without it. They talk among themselves about other cases, other names, other files still waiting. But Ohio 1995 always sits beneath those conversations, unspoken but present. A reminder that endurance matters, that attention matters. That time, often blamed, can also be the pressure that reveals what force cannot. The family moves forward carefully, not cautiously, intentionally. They understand now that grief does not end when answers arrive. It reorganizes. It becomes quieter, but more precise. They allow themselves moments of lightness without guilt. Laughter no longer feels like betrayal. It feels earned. They also understand something else now, that the waiting changed them in ways that will never fully unwind. It sharpened certain sensitivities. It dulled others. It taught them how to exist in suspension. That skill does not vanish just because the suspension ends. It becomes part of who you are. The confession itself, replayed less frequently now, remains unsettling in its ordinariness. No dramatic flourish. No cinematic reveal. Just words, spoken after decades of silence, finally crossing a threshold. The simplicity of it troubles people more than any spectacle could have, because it suggests how easily truth can coexist with normal life unseen. Psychologists debate whether the mind compartmentalizes guilt or erodes under it. Ohio 1995 offers no clear answer. The man who confessed lived years unremarkable enough to escape attention. This fact unsettles the town not because it implies danger everywhere, but because it undermines the belief that inner states always reveal themselves outwardly. Trust, after Ohio 1995, becomes something people redefine privately. Not withdrawn. Not naive. Adjusted. They learn to accept that certainty is always partial, that knowing someone is not the same as knowing everything about them. This does not fracture community. It matures it. Media retrospectives attempt to frame the case as closure, as triumph, as resolution. But those inside the story recognize this framing as incomplete. Closure suggests finality. Ohio 1995 feels more like convergence. Threads that ran separately for decades finally cross. They don't tie neatly. They simply meet. The landscape continues to change. New developments rise. Old buildings fall. The physical markers of the past dissolve. But memory does not require landmarks. It travels with people. It reappears in tone, in caution, in the way questions are asked and not asked. At public gatherings, when conversations drift toward the past, there is less urgency to correct details, less need to control the narrative. The facts are settled. What remains is interpretation. And interpretation, unlike evidence, is allowed to vary. Ohio 1995 becomes many things at once: a warning, a lesson, a reference, a quiet presence. The younger generation absorbs it indirectly. not as fear, but as orientation. They sense that something important happened before their time, something that shaped the way adults around them move through the world. They inherit not the story itself, but the posture it produced. Late at night, when the town is still, the absence of the mystery feels almost loud. For years, uncertainty filled the silence. Now the silence stands on its own. Some find it peaceful, others find it disorienting. Both reactions coexist. Neither is wrong. Ohio 1995 no longer demands vigilance in the same way. The search is over, but it leaves behind attentiveness, a quieter, steadier form of watching. Not for suspects, for patterns, for absences, for the subtle signals that say something needs to be noticed. The final truth of the case may not be the confession itself, but the transformation it forced. A community learned how to wait without collapsing, how to question without destroying itself, how to accept that answers do not always arrive on schedule. And as years continue to pass, the case recedes further into history, but never into irrelevance. It becomes a fixed star in the town's internal map, something you no longer navigate toward, but navigate by. Ohio 1995 rests there now. Not active, not dormant, integrated. A story finished in words, but ongoing in effect. A reminder that silence can last decades, that truth can arrive late, and that when it does, it doesn't reset the world. It rebalances it. And in that rebalancing, in the quieter, steadier rhythm that follows, the true ending of the case continues to unfold. Time keeps moving, indifferent to whether a story feels finished. The calendar pages continue to turn, and Ohio adjusts to a reality where the question mark that once hovered over daily life has finally been replaced by a period. Not a dramatic one. A quiet, definitive at the end of a long, exhausting sentence. Yet, even punctuation has consequences. It changes how the sentence is read, how it lingers in the mind. In the years after the confession, something subtle happens. People stop saying remember when and start saying back then. The language shifts and with it the emotional distance. The case no longer lives in the present tense. It has moved at last into history. But history is not inert. It is active, shaping perspective, altering expectations, teaching without announcing its lesson. Those who lived through the uncertainty develop a shared sensitivity to unresolved things. Not just crimes, arguments left hanging, promises unfulfilled, questions avoided. Ohio 1995 trained them to recognize the weight of unfinished business. Silence is no longer neutral. It carries potential. It suggests pressure building somewhere out of sight. In law enforcement circles, the case becomes shorthand, not for failure, not for triumph, but for duration. When a new investigation stalls, someone inevitably mentions Ohio 1995, not as warning, but as reassurance. Proof that time does not disqualify truth. Proof that patience is not surrender. Younger detectives listen carefully to these stories. They were trained with tools their predecessors never had: databases, digital footprints, constant surveillance. But Ohio 1995 reminds them that technology does not eliminate the human factor. People still lie. People still hide. People still wait decades to speak. The case becomes a counterweight to overconfidence. The family's life expands in directions once postponed indefinitely. Plans that felt impossible during the years of uncertainty, moves, career changes, commitments, now unfold without the constant drag of the unknown. The absence of that drag is noticeable at first, like stepping off a boat and onto solid ground. There is relief, yes, but also imbalance. You have to relearn how to stand. They discover that closure does not erase grief. It reframes it. Grief becomes less amorphous, less overwhelming. It sharpens. It gains edges and contours. You can see where it begins and ends. That clarity hurts, but it also allows movement. Ohio 1995 gave them permission to move without guilt. In the town's collective memory, the case gradually sheds its sensational layers. What remains is not the shock of the crime or even the surprise of the confession, but the endurance of the waiting. The decades-long stretch where nothing happened outwardly, yet everything happened internally. Anxiety, suspicion, hope, fatigue, repetition. This becomes the true story people remember. Public discussions about justice grow more nuanced. The case complicates simple narratives about good and evil, about swift accountability and clean resolutions. Ohio 1995 demonstrates that justice can be delayed without disappearing, and that delay itself reshapes lives in ways verdicts rarely acknowledge. At memorials unrelated to the case, at gatherings meant for other purposes, someone occasionally brings it up, not to reopen wounds, but to contextualize resilience. It becomes an example of survival through uncertainty. A reminder that communities are not just defined by what happens to them, but by how long they carry unanswered questions without fracturing. The man who confessed fades from public consciousness. His name loses its charge. He becomes a footnote rather than a focal point. This, too, feels appropriate. Ohio 1995 was never really about him. It was about absence, about waiting, about the space between event and explanation. The confession closed the door, but it was never the centerpiece of the room. As years pass, physical reminders disappear almost entirely. Buildings are renovated. Streets are renamed. Even the places once central to the investigation blend into ordinary geography. But memory doesn't need coordinates. It persists in habits, in reflexes, in the way people respond when something feels unresolved. There is a noticeable change in how the town responds to new crises. Less panic, less speculation, more restraint. Ohio 1995 taught them the cost of premature certainty. They wait for facts. They allow investigations to unfold. They remember how wrong it feels to live for years inside a false conclusion. The case's influence stretches beyond the town itself. It enters training manuals, academic papers, documentaries watched by people who have no emotional stake in it. For them, it's an object of study. For the town, it's lived experience. The difference matters. Analysis can explain outcomes. It cannot replicate endurance. At some point, a local journalist writes a final retrospective, not dramatic, not investigative. Reflective. It doesn't chase new angles. It asks a simpler question. What did this do to us? The answers are varied, sometimes contradictory, but they share a theme. Ohio 1995 taught patience without passivity, awareness without paranoia, memory without fixation. The article doesn't trend. It doesn't go viral, but it circulates quietly. People read it late at night, recognize themselves in its lines, and set it aside without comment. Not everything meaningful demands reaction. The town continues. That is perhaps the most important detail. It continues not because the case is solved, but because it always did. Through years of uncertainty, life went on. Births, deaths, routines, celebrations. The confession didn't restart life. It simply removed a long-standing weight from it. Ohio 1995 now exists as a layered memory. For some, it is personal. For others, inherited. For most, it is integrated, no longer foreground, but never erased. It has become part of the town's internal grammar, shaping how stories are told and how silence is interpreted. And so the story extends forward, not as narrative, but as influence. It no longer asks questions. It offers context. It sits quietly behind decisions, behind caution, behind the understanding that some truths take decades to surface, and that waiting for them changes you in ways that answers alone never could. The case is over. The effects are not. They ripple outward, softer with each passing year, but still detectable to those who know how to listen. And in that listening, in the long attention learned through decades of not knowing, the legacy of Ohio 1995 continues to speak, long after the last word was finally said.